Hi everyone, thank you for taking the time to view my presentation and to actively participate in my academic growth while simultaneously continuing to contribute to the dialogue and discourse we've all been having on international education. It's been a journey, so I greatly appreciate your feedback and look forward to taking on your suggestions. Before I get things started, I want to highlight that my 6-slide summary varies slightly from the assignment details in the exemplars. As some of you know, after consultation of my research objectives and the environmental context in which my action research took place, I opted to seek and obtain formal research approval from the university's Ethical Review Board, and in turn from the school boards in which I conducted my research. If you're interested in hearing more about this process, please click on the icon on the bottom left of this slide. You may have to halt this presentation and come back to us. A little background on my research. UWO 2000 argues that people from dominant groups benefit most from the intercultural education. However, much of the existing research and literature in the area of international students focuses on how student learning can be enhanced through outbound international learning experience, where one is typically part of the minority group. There's been little attention on how the presence of international students alters the learning and social landscape for domestic students, which leads me to my research question. From the perspective of teachers, what is the value of having international students in secondary schools in Halton Region? For those of you not familiar with Halton, this is a region located between Toronto and Hamilton, Ontario in Canada. I do want to mention that while I recognize the need and value of having the student voice considered in this investigation, I was limited by approvals required by schools and school boards in which I was conducting my research. That being said, I feel that there are advantages to exploring this topic from a teacher perspective. The research design included 3 parts. The first part involved an analysis of policy documents, academic scholarly articles, and existing literature on the topic. While this provided some background for my investigation, the lack of literature at the secondary level of education and increased presence of international students in Halton Region suggested to me that boards and schools in Halton would benefit from research that explores how the presence of international students alters the learning landscape. The second part included a quantitative data analysis that looked at the international student enrollment patterns at a national level as well as at schools across Halton Region. This information provided contextual background and was used to select which schools would have had educators participate in the research. Motivated by my role as an educator, my research question was aimed at understanding the perspective of teachers. Therefore, the third part of my data collection involved conducting interviews with educators from different separate, public, and independent secondary schools in Halton. The interviews were unstructured in nature. However, participants were asked questions about their experience with international students in their classrooms and schools, the value of these students with a focus on international learning, and the supports required for these students to enable their success in school. Interviews were approximately 20 to 30 minutes in length and took place face-to-face at the educator's school. Participants were provided with a letter of information and were required to give consent by signing a form. With regards to identifiable information, full name was collected for communication needs only. Subjects taught and numbers of year teaching were also collected as part of the general interview data and have been used in the findings only where patterns and commonalities emerged. On to what I felt was one of the most challenging parts, data analysis. Given the small-scale nature of the study, data was analyzed manually, and responses were compared in order to obtain an in-depth understanding of the value that international students bring to the learning environment for all learners. Through all of this, I was able to identify 2 primary areas in which to organize my findings. The first being how the presence of international students influences the development of intercultural relationships both in the classroom and within the school environment as a whole. And secondly, the ways in which the presence of international students shapes teacher practice. The consensus from the teachers interviewed was that there was little intercultural interaction between international and domestic students, whether that be in a social context, in the formal classroom, or within the context of the school environment. From a social perspective, all the teachers observed that students remained siloed and tended to stick to their own cultural cliques. Some commented how this was to be expected. When you don't know anyone, or in a foreign and new environment, it is natural to gravitate to the familiar. Despite the comments about how the presence of international students was furthering social divisions that naturally exist in secondary schools, teachers interviewed also highlighted the many positive ways that international students were contributing to shaping the internationalization of the classroom and school environment. Under the right conditions in the classroom, teachers felt that international students brought new perspectives to the classroom. As for the impact international students have on the school environment, All of the schools who had teachers participate in my research offer a variety of co-curricular activities that promote intercultural connection and understanding. That being said, student engagement in these activities, along with participation in school sports teams, was high to low depending on the school. Just as student participation in co-curriculars and sports varies across schools, the teachers interviewed expressed a range of thoughts on how the presence of international students influenced their own teaching practice. Language acted as a barrier in a social setting and flowed into the classroom learning environment, with teachers highlighting that the influence that international students had on their pedagogical choices depended heavily on the students' language abilities. Shifting to my findings on subject, content, and curriculum. Despite what we have learned from Colby 2006, highlighting the benefits of interculturalism being incorporated across subjects, teachers commented that their ability or perceived opportunity to employ intercultural strategies in their classroom depended heavily on which subject they taught. Those in the humanities found it easier to incorporate cultural perspectives than those in the maths or sciences. Teacher participants also cited the strong demands of the Ontario curriculum expectations as limiting their opportunity to, quote, take the time away from what is legally required learning. Like with language, the social divisions between international and domestic students that I previously mentioned translated into the classroom. Some educators commented that the very presence of international students allowed for intercultural learning. However, others reflected that without direct intervention or pedagogical choices by the teacher, such as selective seating plans, teacher-driven group work, student placement, intercultural opportunities, there was little to no spontaneous interaction between the student groups. Which raised the question, and perhaps this is an area for future study, on whether or not forced intercultural interaction was helping to promote the desired learning outcomes of internationalization, or was it hindering? As a final note for now on my findings, every teacher participant interviewed drew personal reflections on how the presence of international students in the classroom made them more aware of their own cultural assumptions, and that having international students in their classroom provided them with the opportunity to reflect on how different students approach learning. As I previously highlighted, my literature review involved an analysis of policy documents, academic and scholarly articles, and existing literature on the topic. All of this provided useful contextual background for my investigations, and the lack of literature on the internationalization of secondary schools and the synchronous learning opportunities between international and domestic students at that level of schooling highlighted to me a large gap in current research. My first step was to look at international student enrollment numbers on a national and local scale. As all K-12 teachers in Ontario are mandated to follow Ministry of Education curriculum guides and strategies, I found that an exploration of the ministry's policies in regards to global and international education were useful in understanding the drivers behind the internationalization of secondary schools. From there, I reviewed existing academic and scholarly articles on the internationalization of learning environments, and subsequently intercultural learning. Miriam Minnie's postulations that the increasing effects of globalization and demanding efforts of post-secondary institutions to globalize suggests that internationalization does not suddenly emerge in tertiary education, but rather stems from the secondary level or even early. This became the foundation for my understanding of the process in Ontario schools. As post-secondary institutions seek applicants who are globally aware, the onus is on the secondary institutions to develop learners who possess the required knowledge and skills. While focused on the higher ed space, Kyra Garson's work on understanding the correlation between internationalization and intercultural learning provided theories and concepts that could be translated into the secondary space. She brought to my attention that effective internationalization of the learning environment could not be done without systemic and intentional pedagogical considerations that support learning. Researchers like Leask and UWO and Drake further enhanced my investigations into the synchronous learning opportunities between international and domestic students. So what is the point I'm trying to make, and why is it relevant? My point is that teacher participants saw tremendous value in the idealistic opportunities of having international students in the classroom and the potential for synchronous intercultural learning. However, they were challenged by some of the more pragmatic aspects of intercultural education. How could they promote intercultural learning in an environment limited by language barriers, ministry-mandated curriculum documents, and their own intercultural understanding? Teacher perspective of the value of international students is varied and highly dependent on contextual factors that rely on the learner, such as language ability, as well as factors that are dependent on the teacher, such as pedagogical understanding and application. All this to say that ultimately, increased enrollment of international students enrolling in secondary level education in Ontario year after year is a trend that is expected to continue. However, the process of internationalization of secondary schools is a dynamic and fluid process that is very much in its developmental stage and is worth continued exploration. So who is my target audience in sharing my research findings? In my eyes, it is any secondary educator, ESL or ELL teacher or coordinator, school administrator, this includes principals, vice principals, head of schools, school board or district leaders, and government or other policy influencers. My goal is to share the findings of my study as widely as possible in order to further brainstorm or come up with possible solutions. Knowledge mobilization is about linking research results with issues and how research can be used effectively. As such, I feel that my actions align nicely with Miriam's principles of adult learning. With the growing enrollment of international students in secondary schools across the province and country, the majority of teachers have experience teaching international and domestic students, and therefore will be able to bring their own personal experience to the dialogue. In turn, their experience, like that highlighted by the participants in my study, may stimulate the desire to learn more about the intercultural learning process and appropriate pedagogies. Even if I think about my own research investigation, it was inspired by my experience teaching international and domestic students and rooted in the goal to learn more about the present landscape and potential opportunities. Having research and ethical approval for my action research has opened up some alternative opportunities for my capstone project, and in turn how I parlay my research into a professional learning resource. In order to assess opportunities, I found it more effective to take on a knowledge mobilization approach to review how to effectively communicate the results of my research to a larger audience. After looking at the rationale, my intended audience, accessibility, format, and timing, as well as with some helpful encouragement from mentors, I have decided to pursue publication opportunities for my article. I am currently looking at conference as well as academic journal submission requirements. However, for the purposes of this course and program, I've decided to submit a professional learning reflection article to Professionally Speaking magazine, as well as Canadian Teacher magazine. My goal here is to share the results of my action research, thus adding to the current body of evidence and potentially informing future research or policy development. Ultimately, given that these publications are for the most part utilized by educators in Canada and Ontario, it will be about generating awareness and interest in my research within a national and provincial context. For those of you who are unfamiliar with these publications, Professionally Speaking is published quarterly by the Ontario College of Teachers to inform its members about the activities and decisions of the college. This magazine provides a forum for discussion of issues relevant to the future of teaching and learning, teachers' professional learning, and our standards of practice. Canadian Teacher magazine is an independent national magazine produced 3 times per year. It is designed for K-12 educators and aims to keep Canadian teachers informed of current trends in education by offering informative articles on instructional strategies and methodologies, classroom management, professional and personal development, and national and international issues. I have opted to look into publication opportunities with both of these magazines, given the similar submission guidelines, their applicable timelines, and the similarities in their audience. I'm currently communicating with both magazines in order to fully understand their format guidelines and 100% confirmed timelines, but from my understanding from their respective websites is that they are looking for 800 to 1,000 word magazine articles that translate research or experience into informational reflections on the practice of teaching and learning. If I hope to have it published in winter 2020 editions, I would be required to submit by fall 2019. I'm still working on how I will track the effectiveness of sharing my research via these platforms. However, my initial thoughts of knowledge mobilization indicators go towards looking at the number of copies distributed or requested, the number of downloads, hits, visits, media exposure, and most importantly, the number of follow-up inquiries I receive. That being said, I still need to explore how I might go about tracking any of this and if it is indeed required at this stage in the process. As a final note, I hope that I've highlighted the reflective nature of my study and subsequent knowledge mobilization strategies throughout my presentation. However, by means of wrapping things up, I want to highlight that I welcome any and all feedback, and as I said in my opening, I look forward to continuing our conversations.